Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another interview from the audio archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing you the first half of my conversation with Dr. Aaron Balick. We spoke on November 13th, 2015. If you'd like to read a full transcript of our conversation, you can check the link below down in the description, and also down below you'll see a link to my Patreon where your support helps me continue on with this project. Thanks.
Right, okay. Well, my name is Aaron Balick. I am a psychotherapist and author of the Psychodynamics of Social Networking, based in London, but originally from the East Coast, from Delaware. And let's see, my connection to tech, I think, is probably unusual. And when I go to tech conferences, I notice my unusualness there. And, basically, what happened is, I'm a jobbing psychotherapist, which means I spend most of my days not using technology, speaking face to face to people in a room. And several years ago, I won't go into the details of the story, but it is in my book. A client of mine, in a moment of distress, Googled me. Because this client was looking for, reaching out for the safe person that they knew, and they were in distress in the middle of the night. I wasn't going to be at the phone. They weren't able to come around and see me. And when they Googled me, they found out a whole lot more about me than they knew. And this turned out to be very distressing for them. And because we were in therapy together, we were able to work out the nature of the distress. This happened in about 2005, and I really struggled to understand, if you're familiar with psychotherapy, you know that the psychotherapist often tries to stay out of the room, in a sense. They know a lot more about the patient than the patient knows about the therapist. But the rules have changed, and that's not really the case anymore, so there wasn't much support around to work out how to manage the situation. Anyway, short story, long story, but I'm making it short. We resolved that issue between us in the consultation room, and then it occurred to me that these situations are happening between people all the time without the benefit of psychotherapy sessions to work out the details.
Correct.
Yeah. So I put my mind to understanding what's going on in culture, not in psychotherapy. So the book isn't so much about, how to do psychotherapy around technology, but what are the psychological consequences of the technological world that we live in. So I think I rambled on maybe a little bit too long there, but
no, it's fine. That's perfect. And I am the sort of person that gets excited hearing that because I do not have your credentials, but I think about this stuff a lot. Obviously, if you've seen the very long conversations I've been posting. Mm-hmm. So for people who are not familiar, what is a psychotherapist?
Well, I suppose in the United States, you probably go by psychologist more or psychoanalyst. The psychoanalyst is a particular kind of psychotherapy. Right. I'm a depth psychotherapist, which means I will work with people usually once or twice a week over a long period of time to uncover the less conscious material. So, we're talking the kind of psychotherapy that Freud started, though not, it's changed a lot since then. As opposed to what a lot more people are familiar with these days, which would be cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really talking about what's going on the conscious level, what your thoughts are about things. We go a step further and try and work out what you might not necessarily be thinking, but what might be happening unconsciously.
Okay. So what is, this is the strangest follow-up question, but what is your perception of the video game industry and its audience?
Like I said to you before the interview, I'm kind of an outsider. So when I was playing video games, and this will age me quite a bit, I remember spending my first paycheck on a Nintendo box for my TV, and playing Super Mario Brothers. So that was like a different, that you played video games with yourself, really, and that was it.
Yeah, and no one knew.
No one knew. I mean, you could find like-minded people who could get very excited about where all the secret things were to find, and actually, I had an Atari, and there were even secret places to find, in the Atari games. Now it's very, very different because people are in there and they're also interacting with others who are in there. And there are, as I understand it, major cultures that develop within each of the games. So I would say that I think I would say that there's a relational investment in games today that probably didn't used to exist, meaning it's linked to the desire to relate to others and be recognized and known by others rather than just completing an interesting task within a game.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm kind of obligated to, of course, ask about Gamergate and how your research, maybe into things that tie into, like, mob mentality online or the echo chamber effect on social media. I mean, I guess that's just a very basic question. It's just like, how does your research relate to that? And sort of, as an outsider, what did you notice about it? And what do you, I don't know, I'm being wordy, but I'm curious, just like, what do you make of it? And how does your research tie into it?
I think what I make of it first is I was pretty shocked by the depth of insult and threat that happened.
Yeah.
When you really get into, first you read about it, and again, if you're not a gamer, you're kind of reading about it in the press rather than being in it. And then you think, okay, well, this is just sort of a storm in a teacup. And then you hear what's happening, and you hear people's lives being really taken down, and living in hiding, and all this kind of stuff. I think it's pretty shocking, but unfortunately not necessarily surprising. I think
yes,
because of the human potential to project and scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
I think where it dovetails with my research is when you start talking about more anonymous social networks. So let's say people who are on Twitter whose handles aren't necessarily associated with their names, as opposed to people who are on Facebook and you pretty much know who they are. Mm-hmm. As soon as you kind of take away a real identity, you take away a lot of safety mechanisms that come with being in a society, which primarily is about comeback, but also the emotional consequence of hurting somebody else's feelings, which you don't experience so heavily when you're doing that online, and particularly when you're doing it through a pseudonym or a handle.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure you've heard of the online disinhibition effect, which everybody sort of talks about. And that's just one component of that.
So, I mean, I've heard it said, of course, anonymity is a factor, but, like, I've heard, some of that type of behavior is sort of like road rage in a way, or where it's not, I don't know, it's not just the anonymity of it, but it's sort of like the lack of consequence, mm-hmm. which might be the bigger umbrella. But then I just sort of sit and I wonder about the very broad question of how that sort of behavior gets socialized online.
And when you say socialized, what do you mean exactly?
Well, I guess, like, where there's a community that's able to be built, and it doesn't strike anyone as perhaps,
sure.
not a nice thing or a thing they shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to basics for a second, yeah? So
okay,
let's look at any digital phenomenon that allows people to communicate across it. Yeah, it's like the widest thing. And basically the way that I understand that through psychology is that that being online simply offers an extension of yourself into an online environment. So, I would see that as a psychological or a relational extension. So you will know people who in their offline lives are surrounded by social networks that are either generally supportive or generally highly critical and nasty. Yeah, so there are people who are surrounded by people who don't support them, who take them down, who constantly nitpick, that sort of thing. And other people who who when they get a job, their friends are envious about it, they talk about them behind their back. It's just not a very healthy friendship network. Mm-hmm. You might have someone else who has quite a healthy, positive friendship network, and most people will fall somewhere in the middle, mostly supportive, but with some people that aren't, or the other way around.
Yeah.
You take that into its extension on Facebook, if you're someone who has a generally supportive network around you, it's kind of what it's going to look like on Facebook. Yeah, it's just an extension of that. If you bring your not so supportive network and put it online, it's going to look less supportive because it's an extension of that.
Yeah.
You add on to that different kind of cultures. You know, you go into one nightclub and there's going to be a fight every night, and you go into another nightclub and everybody's dancing. You go into something like Ask FM. I don't know if they use that much in the States, but it was a big deal here for an anonymous place for young people to ask each other questions.
Right.
It just had a culture of nastiness. So it's like going into the bar where there's going to be a bar fight.
So, I mean, that is something, it's obviously a thing, you know, where a lot of different platforms have different cultures, and this is a very broad question. I mean, like, why does that happen when it all ostensibly is, you know, quote unquote, the internet?
It gets kind of complicated because the internet you could just imagine as being, you know, a massive public space. So like any public space, like in a city, you're going to have, you know, dark streets and bright streets. You know, you're going to have the dark web and you're going to have the not so dark web. And then people create cultures around themselves there. So, you know, you could be on Twitter and be surrounded by following and being followed by people where it's all pretty much, you know, information sharing and pretty okay, no big deal. And, you know, every once in a while, people get each other's backs up and they work through it. Or you could just find it a consistent torrent of awfulness. And that's because that's where you are in the internet, if you see what I mean.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the people help create that culture, but it also comes down to how that particular technology mediates what you're doing. So Facebook, in a sense, is a little bit safer because for the most part, you're going to know the people that are around you and they're going to know who you are, so that there is some kind of personal comeback and consequence.
Yeah.
The less that's possible, the more it's easy to transgress social norms and get nasty. And also the easier it is to see others more as objects than as subjects. So you won't even necessarily consider that you're hurting somebody else's feeling because you're just going to be in your own space about it, particularly if other people are ganging up.
So, I mean, why is it difficult for people to treat things they think is, like, you know, stupid or wrong as simply benign on the internet? Like, I wonder about that, and is it just that, like, maybe a lot of people actually do feel that way, but the oxygen is sort of taken up by people who feel a little bit more loudly about it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know from some of the research that I have encountered that does tend to be true, that people who are trolling literally take up more space on the internet than people who aren't. So you could almost say that there might be a kind of a disposition of someone who wants to be loud and stir things up and cause harm. Mm-hmm. So even if there are fewer of them, which I think is the case, they're really good at their jobs in a sense, which is, you know, stirring up a lot of shit and making themselves very, very visible in that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it doesn't have to just be trolls. It could also be people who, I don't know if your circles of the internet have this, but there is this in video games where there are sort of like self-appointed guardians of a medium, or people who are trying to mete out justice,
yes.
Or they really don't like what one person is doing and they want everyone to know that. I mean, so like I don't know, is it just that like there are actually probably a lot of people who consider those sorts of things they're speaking about to be harmless, but they're just not saying anything. We just hear the people who are saying things.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing because you say in my end of the internet, you know, you'd be surprised what kind of rancor psychoanalysts can get up to with each other when they cross certain boundaries. You know, if somebody's a little bit too Jungian and not Freudian enough, I mean, it's kind of, you know, the whole history of psychoanalysis is breakdowns and fights and schisms, and so I would say, you know, kind of paradoxically, again, stating my ignorance about the gaming world, I would imagine that fundamentally the same thing is going on. And what's going on in those cases is people become very closely identified with their whatever flag it is that they're waving. Right. So how things should be done. So it doesn't. So when you strip that down, it's not just you're doing it the wrong way, or you're cheating, or you shouldn't say that, but it's experienced as a personal attack.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're saying, yeah. Was that a question, or you were
checking your understanding? I guess if I'm making sense.
Can you restate that again? I'm sorry, I was listening in the incorrect way then.
Right. No, I was just saying. I just wanted to make sure you understood what I just said.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. As a personal attack, that is correct. I definitely do see that on this end of that internet. Yes.
Yeah. So when people feel personally attacked, whether it's about gaming or whether it's about, what football team they support, they can get very violently defensive about it. And when you start to get violently defensive, you do this thing that we call in psychoanalysis called splitting, where you don't see the good in the other anymore. Everything becomes very, very black and white. And then, in a sense, you get psychological permission to attack hard and to scapegoat.
And, I mean, is it just the digital disconnect, like, that makes it easier to go harder? Like, I mean, I often look at it and it just seems like people are kind of forgetting, there's a person on the other end.
Yeah. Well, I think, I think the digital platform enables the objectification of other people. So if you're dealing with someone who's, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a silly handle, brown trash can, So this is obviously what I'm looking at because I'm not creative enough to come up with anything.
Oh, okay.
But
I thought you were being really creative there.
Well, if brown trash can says something that offends you, you're just looking at a handle of brown trash can. You don't have a name. You don't have eyes looking back. You don't know what their age is. You don't know where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to say really nasty things to them.
Well, I'm sure you saw. I think was it. There were, I'm sure you've seen these pieces that have popped up here and there over the last couple of years about how Twitter is dead and this is dying and this form on the internet is dying. But there was a thing in The Atlantic, I think a couple of weeks ago, that phrased it really well. It said that utterances are treated as unequivocal political statements by people outside the conversation, where it seems like there's a leap happening from what you said of people objectifying other people, but also like everything they're saying where they kind of it's like they call it like context smush or whatever, but it's like they also forget the fact that like they weren't being spoken to, or that maybe, it's like people are choosing to read into things that are not there. And I often wonder, like, have we always been doing this? Is this happening at a more accelerated rate because of the internet? Is this one of those now not normal but typical things? Have we always been like that?
Well, I would argue that the psychology is exactly the same. It's just how it's expressed and how it's enabled to be expressed. So, you mentioned road rage before. So, road rage is the same psychology of rage and frustration, but encapsulated in metal and glass with anonymous people around you that can kind of, enable you to get it out of your system in a way that you think is relatively safe. I mean, it's not always safe because someone in that other car might, come out with a gun or something.
Right.
You might have quite strong feelings of rage or attraction for someone that you keep, relatively well under wraps, and then 3 martinis later, either the kiss or the punch comes, So the psychology is the same, but the alcohol enables the inhibitions to drop. Yeah. So depending on what platform you're operating on, if someone isn't fully a subject to you, if they're also then taken out of context, and on top of that you're identified in a particular political position, then all of these things add up to make it much more easily to sit there in front of your computer without that person in front of you and demolish them and get other people to demolish them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's still like an emotional contagion. It's still about projection. It's still about evacuating anger. It's all the stuff that we've had for centuries. It just we've created ways to deploy it much more easily.
And so, I mean, when you have an ecosystem, when you are able to deploy it much more easily, I mean, that's something I've been wondering about is, like, are we somewhat quicker now to make judgment calls about other people now on the internet?
I think it...
which is such a hard thing to measure, but I'm always wondering that.
I think it is. I think it is a really hard thing to measure. I don't know how deep it goes. Yeah, because so when you say a judgment call, I don't know if that's like maybe a surface judgment call that's being made, or whether it goes particularly deep. Because the catch here is, and it's not really good news, but in a sense, the more primitive a defense you have, the better it kind of feels. So if you can really just be angry at someone and think that somebody is wrong and show them how wrong they are, that actually feels good. Yeah. So if there's a tweet that you can use as evidence that they're wrong, even though you're doing that by taking it out of context, there's a way in which you can use that as an excuse to feel good by getting a bunch of crap off your chest, which actually has very little to do with that other person or what's going on. It has much more to do with you expressing a series of emotions that you have that have been as yet unprocessed.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. And it's how we protect ourselves, isn't it? You know, when it happens to us, we think, oh, it's not really about me. It must be them. You know, it's what we say about bullies. You know, oh, they're just envious.
Yeah.
But it does, you know, it's hard not to be hurt if you're on the other side of that, in any case.
Yeah. So, I mean, another thing I noticed, too, about at least Twitter, or I guess like all social media, is, you know, it's a form of asynchronous communication where, you know, I understand it, where like people don't have much more to go off of to sort of glean, you know, a sense of, you know, like what I'm like or what you're like or what whoever is like. But, you know, it's being gleaned from flares sent into the digital air, like, you know, sometimes several hours apart or several days apart. Mm-hmm. And when you think that you know someone from those sorts of very spread out things, I mean, what sort of mistakes might somebody be making in reaching their conclusion and reacting?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so this is a matter of complexity, yeah? So
yes.
In any, say, in real life, offline situation, face-to-face conversation, you have the highest level of complexity, and that goes from unconscious person-to-person communication to body language to eye contact to the history of how long you've known them to touch, you know, tone of voice, all of it. Mm-hmm. And if you know someone and then it moves online, there is, I believe, a capacity to take that forward. So if they're being bantery online and you know them historically, then you know it's banter because you know them well enough to put it in that context. The more you remove yourself from the high context intersubjective interaction, the more you have to fill in the details, and the less likely you are to fill them in correctly.
Yeah.
So in the example that you give, let's say people who haven't known each other previously, they only know each other through text, and these texts are coming asynchronously and infrequently.
Yes.
Then you have, you know, it's a recipe for passion or disaster, or usually both. Yeah.
They're not usually far away.
No, I mean,
but they can be.
Yeah, or it's passion first and then it's disaster. Usually not the other way around.
Yeah.
But the reason why it's passion is because you do this thing, you know, we call it transference. You fill in the blanks with all of your fantasies and ideals, and because there's not enough evidence to dissuade you, it builds and builds and builds, and then suddenly this complete different part comes in, and you're thinking, well, this isn't who I thought that was. And rather than being able to incorporate that into a complex other person, oftentimes it turns into its reversal, which is a feeling of let down, you know, sometimes hatred, sometimes attack. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just there's not a central core of real I don't want to say it's unreal relating, because I think it is real relating. I just think it's much more difficult to manage difference when you're communicating like that than it is to manage sameness.
Yeah.
So long as you're on the right path together, it's fine. But when it starts to come apart, if there's not enough complexity to hold it together, it can come apart very quickly.
Mm-hmm. So this is maybe quasi-related, but why do some people sometimes feel threatened when someone with a large number of followers on Twitter, for example, like just them saying something even consequential, like what is it that makes somebody think that a number and somebody saying something is a threat to them?
Are you saying that the statement would be about them or about?
It's not even about them. No, I mean, like that's what I see a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Is like someone will take offense with what somebody else is saying. The person who said the thing, maybe they have a couple thousand followers on Twitter, 8,000, 10,000, could even be 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone else will hop in and just start dressing them down, or I guess that's putting it politely. Like,
okay.
I mean, why does that happen? That's a very broad question, but I'm curious about like someone just like, what is it that's spurring someone to that action?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably going to be pretty idiosyncratic in a way. So, each individual who's doing that will probably have a whole series of complex reasons. But to not weasel out of the question completely, I think you could say, like a generalization, a psychological generalization one might make is that there are individuals who have difficulty with authority. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that in the Twitterverse, authority comes by way of followers and retweets and, reputation, clout scores, that kind of thing. It's a bit of a false authority. Not necessarily, but let's say it can be a false authority. But if you're kind of wired to bring down authority in the first place, then that's just a big invitation to do so. Yeah?
Yeah.
Just for the sake of it. However, if that person is saying something that you're very closely identified with, and you take offense at it, it's also easier to attack authority on a much more level playing field like Twitter than it would be in real life. So say you're at a conference and somebody's up on the panel and they say something that would offend you equally as much. Are you going to tweet something offensive with a hashtag, or are you going to stand up and say that thing out loud to someone who's, in front of 1,000 people who's up on the panel? So it's
probably
easy.
Going to tweet something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's interesting, the notion of authority. Like, what are the other ways that you see authority being perceived online?
Well, similarly to the sorts of things you were talking about before, like online enables all sorts of different nodal points of power to be quite manipulative. So, you think about how politicians might use something like Twitter. All they really have to do is pull out an out-of-context quote from their opponent and tweet it in the right kind of way. And then what you're doing is you're also utilizing the thing I was telling you about before. People like to get angry at stuff that they think is wrong. So, look, here's a great opportunity for us all to get really angry at something that's wrong in a case where somebody is completely misrepresented.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be another psychodynamic element that something like Twitter would enable.
Yeah. I mean, is this just a continuation of I don't know, things like Salem witch trials, or just crowd mentalities of let's gang up on something we all think is a problem, or does it seem distinct in any way or separate on the internet the way that these things manifest? I
think essentially, yeah, you have a Salem witch trial, and essentially you also have gladiatorial events.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the books I have been reading for research is like a history of public executions.
Mm-hmm. So in a way you could say it's more benign because there is no physical harm,
Yeah.
Or at least very rarely is there physical harm. But I'd say contrary to that is the more and more we identify with our online selves, the more vulnerable we are too. Because even that Twitter handle or your gaming handle or whatever it is, it's a part of you. And people start taking it down, it hurts. It might not kill you. You might not be burned at the stake. But psychologically it can be pretty damning. And also because of the your sort of digital dossier, it's going to be there forever and people can find it. So that, if someone bullies you in school when you're a kid, that might still hurt when you think about it, but you can't go scroll down to that experience of it. Yeah.
Someday we may be able to.
Well, I think kids today are able to, and
that's true, yeah.
And the other kids know that. So in some ways we're much more vulnerable, psychologically anyway.
So I think I saw, although I couldn't view it since I'm not in the UK right now, you had created some stuff aimed at kids for the BBC, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
So sometimes for my project I do interview some teenagers or children just to, obviously, that's a knowable thing, like what life is like for kids today. Yeah. But what do you think a lot of adults don't realize about what life is like with social media and the internet and growing up with them?
I think the problem is a lot of them are scared of it. And with
children, teenagers are?
No, the adults. Yeah,
they're okay.
The adults don't understand what their kids are getting up to.
Yeah,
and the kids know their way around it, at least technologically, more than the adults do.
Right.
So there's a fundamental level of control that the adults simply don't have. Mm-hmm. But I think the more pernicious thing is that, and it's a generalization, but I think adults, maybe less younger adults now, but adults of my generation, I'm 42, mm-hmm. Are much more likely to be dismissive of what's experienced online. Like, well, just don't look, or, why would you go back to that? Or why does it matter if it happened on Facebook? Or, so what if there's a WhatsApp group that you're not on? And what they should be doing, as any, good enough parent in any situation, is to be very curious about what their children are getting up to and to ask questions and to be told why it's important rather than think better. Yeah?
Yeah. So, it's strange because I wasn't asking that question to tie back into it, but it's almost like, with video games at least, as I'm sure you remember, although you're 10 years older than I am, but, when you had your NES that you bought, most parents, it was treated as a fad, video mm-hmm. games. It was just for kids. And so, Nintendo then is sort of the WhatsApp group of today. Mm-hmm. Could that be a contributor of just like a lot of parents were not interested or ignored it, and then a lot of those kids grew up and became adults and sort of, I don't know why that would manifest into like being so angry about video games, but I guess that's possible.
Yeah, I think
I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. I think there's you take something like you take a lot of boys, for example, mostly boys, but lots of girls too. But a lot of boys are into stuff like Minecraft, yeah. And then the parents get very concerned about their sort of their antisocial child spending hours and hours on Minecraft, and it becomes this kind of locus of anxiety for the parents. Do those parents sit down and ask their kids to show them what they're doing on Minecraft? Because it's a very creative endeavor. There's a lot of creativity that goes into it, and there's a lot of investment in what's made there. Now, right. That doesn't mean it's definitely not pathological, because if it's hours and hours and hours, there can be a detriment to that. But if the parent refuses to see what the draw is, then they're really missing the point. And I think the sophistication of gaming these days, and I actually, I don't game, but I'm very curious about it, because I know it's a deeply complex social endeavor.
Yes.
Yeah. And you're doing it socially with people who you may not have met, who might be around the world, and on teams and, against others, and it's it's a real relational social fact. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So very different from me playing Super Mario Brothers in 1993 or whenever it was.
That still exists. It's just that no one hears it still. There's other stuff that's much louder, and not that it's even bad. It's just that that's not what the experience is for kids these days.
Well, if you can engage, in this whole, fulsome world, with just innumerable different beasts in it and different places to go and different, real people to discover, it seems to be in a different league from Pac-Man at least.
Yeah.